Remember this? This is the iPhone 10 and it came out in 2017, which at this point is already 4 years ago. And it was probably the biggest shakeup that Apple had ever done to their iPhones. It completely changed the way that any of us use our iPhone. Gone had those big bezels, gone had Touch ID, and introduced Face ID, and just a whole screened phone for the first time, besides that notch, obviously. But if you were to look at this phone 4 years later and ask the question, can you still use it in 2021 as your main phone? Then let's have a look. This was the first time that Apple had introduced a phone that went over £1,000, and at the time that seemed ridiculous that you were paying £1,000 for a phone, but now Apple made it pretty much the norm. But I think because of that price range and the way that Apple designed this phone, if you look at this iPhone 10 now in 2021, it doesn't look dated in the slightest bit. In fact, it still looks like a phone that could have come out just last week as a big flagship phone. And actually, if you compared the iPhone 10 and the iPhone 12 Pro that came out this year, from the face of it, from looking at both of them, I think it's really difficult to actually tell which one of these phones is the newest model. And one of the reasons is that the iPhone 10 had that Super Retina OLED display, and that's why it stacks up really well now comparing it to something like the iPhone 12. But the main reason that this phone, if you use it in 2021 as your main phone, the reason it doesn't feel outdated is because of that A11 Bionic chip that Apple put into this phone back in 2017. It means that it is held up really well, and iPhones are known for lasting so long in the way that Apple makes them, but this A11 really has stacked up in 2021 brilliantly. In fact, I've been using the latest iOS 14 on this, and because of that new iOS 14 and that update, it completely refreshed the phone because it made it feel so different. The fact that you could put widgets on this phone, and it gave it a bit of a new experience to use the iPhone 10. Just a slight customization that you could do on it, and that app gallery and all of that stuff, it brought new life to a 4-year-old phone. And that's something that Apple do really well with all of their old iPhones. But as this is 4 years old at this point, it kind of means that there might be 2, maybe 3 more big updates for this iPhone 10. So if you were trying to find one of these now and pick it up, that is something that you probably just need to be aware of. It hasn't got long left before Apple decide that this phone is to be forgotten. Using the iPhone 10 day to day though, actually you don't massively miss one of the newer phones. You have that thing where opening and closing apps is a little bit slower on the iPhone 10 compared to say the iPhone 12 Pro, and you only really notice this when you put it side by side. Some of the apps are noticeably slower opening, but some of them like Twitter and things like that will open up at exactly the same speed. But of course the older a phone gets, the slower it gets, and that is just a natural thing that happens. So even though it's quick now, maybe a year on down the line, it just becomes a little bit slower and a little bit slower, and then it starts to become noticeable. But at the moment, if you were using the iPhone 10, it still feels as speedy and as quick as ever. It can still handle most games pretty well, and I'm not a gamer, I've said this 1,000 times, but if you wanted to play something like Fortnite, or you wanted to go and play Call of Duty Mobile, it can still handle it pretty well at its highest resolution. And don't get me wrong, the phone gets hot, but it can still do it. When the iPhone 10 came out, I used this for 2 years, and that's the first phone, especially with Apple, that I've used for more than one generation, because the 10s came out and I thought what a pathetic upgrade the 10s was. So the 10 was something, and is something, that is a really close phone to my heart. There's something that I will always really love about the iPhone 10. And the only reason I upgraded in the end to the iPhone 11 Pro Max was because I just missed that bigger screen. But going back to this phone and it just being that little bit smaller, I think genuinely this might be the perfectly sized iPhone. And I kind of miss those rounded borders now as well. We have the box feel now of the iPhone 12, but going back to the 10 and just using it for a little bit, it still feels really nice. The The camera is a big thing on iPhones for most people, and the iPhone X's camera, don't get me wrong, it's a really good camera. It's not as good as the cameras that you have now, but I think that if you were to use this as your main phone and just use these photos to put up on Instagram and things like that, the camera is really good. It was an amazing camera back in 2017, and things with the iPhone haven't improved massively in terms of cameras, so you're not really missing out a huge amount. But there is one thing that you'll miss out on, and that is night mode. Night mode was something that wasn't introduced on the iPhones for a couple of years after the iPhone X, so if you're trying to take photos in low light, it can look a little bit fuzzy, a little bit noisy, a bit grainy, so low light photos aren't good with this, but for normal photos, I am still a fan. The phone has those two camera lenses, so just the two, so there is no ultra wide on this. You get a 12 megapixel main lens and you get the 12 megapixel telephoto lens. If you take photos and the light is right and everything is pretty much perfect, then the photos on this can look really good. And if you do a bit of editing on it as well, then there's nothing that this camera can't do that some of the newer ones can do. If you want to record video, then the iPhone X can do that and do it well, because you can record 4K at 60 frames per second, and if you really wanted to, you can do the super slow motion at 1080p at 240 FPS. The biggest downside to using the iPhone X in 2021 is the battery. Obviously, this phone is 4 years old and batteries in phones start to degrade time after time. And because this had fast charging for one of the first times in an iPhone, that fast charging after 4 years of it does start to wear out the battery. Battery longevity on any phone isn't great, but if the phone is still sitting at probably above 80% battery, then you should be okay with it. This one is sat at 84%, and I can go through a day with it, just going through a day with it, but it does start to really play on your mind knowing that the battery is not going to potentially last a whole day. If you're using it like a normal person, or you're just taking some photos and going through Twitter and things like that, then you should be absolutely fine. But it is always handy if you've got this phone to make sure you've got a charger in your bag. The chances are, if you're picking up an iPhone X in 2021, then it's not going to be a brand new iPhone. So the one thing that you'll want to check is just to make sure that that battery health is good. So you can do that by going into settings and battery and checking the health that way. But if there is an iPhone X that you're looking to buy and it's under 80% battery, then I would just go and have a look at something else, because under 80% is going to be a problem. There's actually still a lot to like about the iPhone X. I think it was a little bit ahead of its time, or maybe because Apple haven't really switched up the design in so long until this year that it doesn't feel outdated. Like I said earlier on, I love the size of this phone, and having those rounded edges on the frame is really nice, and you can pick these phones up on something like eBay for 150 to maybe 250 pounds. And if you're looking to get it as like a spare phone and you can pick it up for 150 pounds, then you can't really go wrong with it, because you're still going to have the use of this for maybe 3 more years. You do have the little letdowns, which is going to be that battery. The camera isn't as good as you might think it is, and it can be a little bit slower if you've used the newer iPhones, or a little bit laggier. I'm actually really curious to see whether any of you are still using the iPhone X, and if you're watching this video on the iPhone X, let me know in the comments below. But that question comes back that I asked at the start of the video. Can you use the 2017 iPhone X in 2021 as your main phone? The software holds up, the hardware holds up, everything so far holds up. So the answer is yeah, you can still use this phone as your daily phone in 2021. If you enjoyed the video, then why not give it a like? And of course, if you sub to the channel, that would be great, because that really helps me out. And we'll see you later.